Digital 410 Productions proudly presents What's the Scuttlebutt Podcast?
Good evening, everybody. I'm a little somber, as you can tell. It saddens me to have to put out a episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt Podcast under these sort of situations. Sadly, I guess with the type of business we're in, we kind of have to expect this sort of thing to happen. Jeff is not with us tonight. He's still out in Texas. This is a off-the-cuff, real quick sort of thing I felt was necessary to be done because, one of our listeners reached out to me today. Christoph, thank you so much for reaching out. Christoph helped me kind of organize this interview we did back on episode 55, going back some time. For those of you who've been a long-time listener of this podcast, episode 55, that is when we got excited and we did the review of the Springfield Armory M1 carbine BB gun, but more importantly, we had the great benefit and privilege, if you will, to interview a World War II vet named Keith Anderson. Keith Anderson was a pilot. He's part of the 398th Bomb Group. And right around that time, there was a book in the works that was getting ready to come out called Flying Fortress, Perry Powell's Crew. And it covered some of the stories of Mr. Anderson. And Christoph reached out to me today, and Christoph reached out to me today to share the very sad news that Mr. Keith Anderson has passed away on July 21st of 2020. And I know we got a lot of new listeners and new subscribers to the podcast, and I felt it was only appropriate since Mr. Anderson was so nice to join us via the phone and to give us some of his time and share his stories and his experiences during the war with us, that I would replay that episode for you guys. And so I don't want to say this week's episode, but this week's edition of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast is simply going to be a replay in memoriam, if you will, going back to episode 55. So you can hear the stories from Mr. Keith Anderson himself. Thank you so much, sir, for your service. Rest easily. Thank you so much, sir, for your service. Rest easy. And enjoy your reuniting with your comrades. Thank you, sir. And thank you, guys. Joining us on the phone, coming up here momentarily, he was a pilot for the 398th Bomber Group in World War II, Mr. Keith Anderson. Mr. Anderson, how are you doing today?
I'm doing just fine.
First and foremost, let me thank you for your time, for coming on our show and taking time out of your schedule. I greatly appreciate it. It's gentlemen like you that allow me to share your history with our listening audience and to educate the up-and-coming generations on the sacrifices and the trials and tribulations that your generation went through to make our freedoms possible today. So first and foremost, thank you for your time and thank you for everything you've done for us.
You're very welcome.
Well, let's go back to the beginning, if you don't mind. Where we tend to start all this, first and foremost, is we'll go back a little bit to Pearl Harbor. Do you remember where you were at during Pearl Harbor?
I was a freshman at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and they didn't permit fraternities and sororities at Reed. They had living groups instead, and they were just independent to the college. And I lived in a long structure with several what they called houses in them. The building was probably 1,000 feet long or more. And it was divided, the east end was male living groups, and the other end was female. these houses were 3 stories, and each wing of those 2 wings, men and women, they were further divided by just partition walls. Inside of each, there were 2 or 3 rooms on each floor. Well, they came in and bound and gagged us all individually in bed. They do living groups, and they call them houses. I lived at the time in what was called Doyle House. It's a long story, but we'd had over the years, some of these houses accumulated symbols of their house. And our house was, the symbol was an owl. They called it the Doyle House Owl. And one of the other houses in our wing came in and stole our owl. Then on Sunday evening, we had, it was custom to have an open house where you would invite all the college to come to your house and chit chat.
Kind of a way to encourage new freshmen and that to come possibly join your house?
No, it was just a safe social occasion to get to know other members of the other houses that would come and visit you. Sure. It was just a purely a social expanding your membership of your class.
I got you.
At any rate, they had stolen our owl. So they were having an open house, and it turned out to be the day of Pearl Harbor, which we didn't know was going to be there. We all knew the war was coming, but so they invited us to their open house, which is going to be on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. And so we knew that they were going to feature our owl at the open house, so we wanted to steal it back before they could show it off. So we assembled a bunch of friends on the campus and stormed their house physically, battering our way up to the 2nd floor where the owl would be on display. And somebody came and said that the Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor. Well, that put an end to our raid on their house right away.
Your owl was abducted by the fellow house on campus. They secured it up in the 2nd floor of their home. You guys put together a rescue team. You got some battery rams because, this is your mascot. This represents you, your house, and what you guys are all about. And they abducted it. And so as far as you guys were concerned, the only thing that mattered at that point in time was the retrieval of your beloved owl. And as you're in the middle of literally taking a ram and barging your way into their home or their house to acquire your stolen property, that's when news came down to you guys that the Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor. And it's amazing. Right. It's amazing how quickly your priorities change and how much something that you thought was very important, that your entire existence relied on it, now meant nothing because something far more important just happened. And it's amazing how that changes a young person's priority.
Well, to an extent that's true, but you have to realize that Pearl Harbor wasn't a total surprise. We'd had the negotiations and all kinds of things with Japan leading up to that time. So while the attack on Pearl Harbor itself was unexpected, an altercation with Japan was not unexpected.
Yeah, because part of Japan's deception policy at that point was we were actually getting ready to sit down and kind of not really come up with a peace treaty, but come up with a neutrality treaty saying, hey, you mind your own, we'll mind ours. And they were kind of just playing along to keep us off guard because they knew they were planning this attack. And so, like you said, it really wasn't unforeseen that this may happen because we have had issues with the empire, the Japanese empire, but they were kind of playing a smokescreen tactic by pretending that they were going to sit down and sign this treaty with us, and then they bombed us.
Yeah, well, that's true. So the bombing, of course, was, and particularly the Pearl Harbor, was totally unexpected. At any rate, it put an end to our raid to recover our owl very soon. And from then on, the inclination is to go down and join the army to fight the Japanese. But and some of the folks did that right away. But most of us, feeling the war was coming on, had already started thinking about how we were going to end up serving our country.
Before we move on into your enlistment into the military, just for our listeners' sake, out of the sense of patriotism and solidarity, did the other house relinquish your owl back to you?
Did we ever what?
Did they ever give you your owl back to you out of a sense of patriotism and solidarity as a single nation after the bombing? Did they
give us back our owl?
Did they give it back to you?
It's been stolen several times since then. It became practically a tradition.
I'm just picturing this in a movie sense. And in the movie, I think, to get everybody on the side of everyone, you would have that scene where the head of the other house would come down the stairs and say, you know what? It's not worth it, and just hands the owl over to you guys. And then you go on to deal with enlisting into the Marines or the Army or to the Army Air Corps or what have you. So I just wanted to find out if you guys did, in fact, get the owl back.
Yeah. They ended up having their open house that night, and I think presented us back. But we didn't get it back from our raid, no.
Yeah.
At any rate, our individual focus then was stimulated to decide how you individually were going to participate in the war. And a friend of mine and I, of course, the Navy was very active recruiting in the Northwest all along. For some reason, the Navy never did appeal to me. My dad had been in the Army as a truck driver and mechanic, and so I was geared towards serving in the Army like my dad had done. And most of my focus was on the Army. A friend of mine and I neither one of us had done any private flying. I'd built a few model airplanes when I was in school, but I'd never dreamed of being a pilot. But we decided, the two of us, to join the Army Air Force. So we went down to the Portland Army Air Base and enlist in the U.S. Army Air Force. But at that time, of course, the country was going from practically zero military to what was soon to be a 13 million or more men that belonged to one of the services.
Yeah, because after World War I, quote unquote, the war to end all wars, we were kind of, basically the Marine Corps was the only real branch that had any sort of funding. That's why they got sent down to the Philippines and to land on Guadalcanal. And you're absolutely right. Because of the fatigue, if you will, of the American people after World War I, we had no desire to participate in any sort of conflict, which is why we, up until this point, were pretty much only participating in the war through the Lend-Lease program. But we actually, as you said, our military was at an all-time low, really, at that point, with the exception of the funding for the Marine Corps. But the Marine Corps was still using rifles and gears that their fathers used in World War I. They were still using 1903 bolt-action rifles. And now here we are. We get sucker punched, kind of, by the Japanese. And now we realize, okay, participating in the war strictly by lending jeeps and tanks and weaponry and uniforms to the Allies, that's not going to cut it anymore. Now we really need to turn up our engines, if you will, and put together multiple branches of the military to help protect our country and to participate in the overall war.
Well, and particularly in the Northwest, which felt more of a kinship towards Hawaii than most of the country did. So remember Pearl Harbor became a real motto, attracted a great following here. At any rate, my partner, or my buddy and I had joined the Air Force after Pearl Harbor as aviation cadets. Why we settled on aviation cadets, I'm not sure, but we did. And of course, the massive influx of volunteers at that time, and the armed services weren't able to cope with all of them, train them all at once. So they just put you on a waiting list. And the months rolled by, and we were getting more involved in the war all the time from a military standpoint, and particularly with the Navy, which, close to the Northwest here. The months rolled by and school seemed less relevant studying ancient history than did participating in the war. So we were getting pretty antsy. And then all of a sudden, in February of 42, I got orders from the U.S. Army Air Force to be, and they were addressed not to an aviation cadet, but to private first class, Keith W. Anderson. Well, that was my first kind of a shock with the military, or enlisted to be an aviation cadet. And what had happened, I found out with this great influence of people joining the Air Force to be pilots or navigators or whatever. They were getting so many fellows in all at once, and they were having a very high washout rate. People that just couldn't learn to fly soon enough and well enough. So they devised this program which they put into play. We were the first group that was in an air training program as a private, and they sent you to college. There was a 5-month college course for aviation cadet training.
You made reference to the high washout rate back then at the time. Just for the edification for our audience, we got to remember back then we didn't have the vitamins, the proteins, the health regimen we have now, and the technology to maintain one's vision. And so back then, a lot of people were colorblind. Their vision wasn't as well as it is today. Obviously, we didn't have corrective surgery like we have now. And so one of the leading factors, or two leading factors I would assume, and you could tell me, is one, people's vision. But let's also keep in mind that these planes back then, the navigational systems were the top of their time, but compared to nowadays, they're very rudimentary. And correct me if I'm wrong, you guys had to be pretty good with math, especially when it came to navigating and using basically to know where you are on the globe when you're in flight, correct?
Well, it was a lot to learn in ground school, but just the flying itself, learning the skills of landing and bad weather at night. A lot of people just couldn't take the pressure of learning the act of flying itself. So there was the ground school that some of them couldn't cope with, and the actual flying. Now, washout came from the flying generally.
Now, do you remember the first time you went up in an airplane, the feeling you had, the sensation you got, and was there any part of it that made you say, I really want to do this, or was there a part of you said, whoa, I don't know if I can handle this?
No, I didn't wonder if I could handle it. It was a lot of fun, and I can sort of remember that first flight, but I didn't come down particularly exhilarated, because by then I'd been in, well, let me back up to those college training detachments.
Sure.
When they first started the program, they, on the basis of testing that they did and on your previous record, they divided you into 5 groups. One group which would graduate each month. And from then, after, all groups would go for 5 years in the college training detachment. So I'd just come out of college, and I was passing high grades in all the tests they were giving me. So I was put in the second group. At that time, the Air Force was graduating 1 class per month, or approximately 1 per month, about 10 or 11 per year.
Can you remember off the top of your head how many cadets were in each class that graduated each month?
No.
Okay, I was just
I don't.
okay. I was just trying to do the math to try to figure out how long it would take for us to fulfill the need for pilots at that time, because obviously we were in a big hurry. However, if we're doing 1 a month, obviously they had the numbers sorted out so that we could sustain the need that we had for our pilots. I was just curious.
Okay, they had the Air Command divided into 3 sections: the Pacific Coast, the Midwest, and the East Coast. And each one of them had their own cadet programs, and they operated separately from each other from an operational standpoint. So at any rate, when I finally got my orders, it came through the private T.W. Anderson, and rather than go to the Pacific Coast Command, I was assigned to the Midwest Command, which was headquartered in at Randolph Field in Texas. And I was disappointed, but there wasn't anything I could do about it except go on with the flow. First of all, the idea was you'd get 1 month of basic military training before you even went to 5 months of college. So my initial assignment was to Buckley Field in Denver, Colorado. So when I got my first orders, I was a private, and I was being sent to Buckley Field in Denver, Colorado. Up to that point, I'd been thinking in terms of the Pacific Command, which was centered out of Southern California, and Santa Ana was the focal point for the Pacific Coast Training Command. I forget what the East Coast was. Some air base down in Florida. At any rate, there I was, first in Denver, Colorado, and then sent out to my college training detachment that I was assigned to was at Southwest Missouri State Teachers College. And I was put in the second graduating class. As I said, they had a class of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, for some reason, weather officers, and a few other officer groups. But once you started training, you were going into one specialty to another. After a week in Denver and 2 months in Missouri, I was sent to Randolph Field in Texas. And that's where they made assignments into the training command. You took a lot of tests, physical tests, mental tests, and so forth. And each day they would come out with a list of who went where. And I was down there about a week, and my name hadn't come up on any list at all to go and talk to anybody. And all of a sudden there it is on the list, and I'm assigned the Class 44B, which would be the second graduating class of 1944. By the time my turn came to go to start out student aviation routine, they were getting ready to send out Class 44A, and all of a sudden they'd end up short of people for 44B, so they had to take some of those fellows and move them into 44A. Well, I'd been just on the borderline between the two. So I ended up actually joining and becoming an aviation cadet with a class of 44A. At that time, there were 3 phases of training for pilots. One was primary flight training, basic flight training, and advanced flight training, about 2 months each. So that was close to a 9-month process. In primary training, you started out with a single engine, fixed wing, fixed landing gear training plane. A lot of them were the popular Stearman twin wing airplane. A lot of cadets learned to fly in those. And Fairchild PT-19s, PT standing for primary trainer, and 19 was the designation. So I learned to fly basic flying in that, landing, taking off, aerobatics, precision flying over the ground for navigation training purposes. And that was an intense course. 1/2 a day of flying and 1/2 a day of ground school. And the ground school subjects you were studying were compatible with the flying training you were getting. And it would be night flying navigation, and then basic military training in the ground school.
And I'm sure as you're doing your in-flight training in your Fairchild PT-19, the brass and those who are in charge of the training are probably assessing which pilots would be best as a fighter pilot, which pilot would be best as a bomber pilot.
Well, they were just concerned with teaching you their phase of the training. Now, the selection became between, say, somebody destined to be a fighter pilot and somebody was a bomber pilot, was when you went from basic to advanced flying training. If you were going to be a fighter pilot, you just continued with a single engine airplane, AT-6, which is still, they're still flying AT-6 all around the country. You got to actually make a decision whether you wanted to go to single engine advanced or multi-engine advanced. Multi-engine, obviously, is 2 engines on up. You just practice to learn how to fly a twin engine airplane.
What was the deciding factor for you to go with the dual engine advance as opposed to the single engine advance? What attracted you to being to going up in the bomber as opposed to the fighter planes?
Well, I didn't know much about fighter planes, except I knew about the P-38 because they were flying all around the Northwest during the first 2 years of the war. So I was familiar with the P-38. It had twin engines, and I decided I wanted to be a P-38 pilot, so I better go to twin engine. Turned out that was the best way to get into P-38s, but at any rate, that was my thinking at the time. I didn't know much about airplanes at all. I knew a B-17 actually. They were built in Seattle. I knew the difference between bombers and fighters, but I didn't know the slightest idea of what was involved with each. When my time came, I selected twin engine advanced, and I ended up at Lubbock Field in western Texas. And that's where I actually finally graduated and got my wings on January 7th of 1942. Along with getting your wings, having this ceremony where they pinned them on you and so forth, you got orders to your next position, which was, forget what they call it. It was an assignment center. It's where you went out as a brand new second lieutenant, brand new pilot.
The replacement depot?
Yeah, replacement depot. Right. First of all, you were given a 30-day leave at home and then sent to what was called a rest and recuperation center, where after all of and there was a lot of pressure on during flying training. You were supposed to be able to get rested and recuperated from that rigorous training. And there you would also get your first assignment for actual tactical training. So I was sent to Salt Lake City, Colorado, which was a replacement center for the West Coast. Well, maybe it was for everybody. I don't really remember that now. I know there were hundreds of guys that were assigned to Salt Lake City replacement depot, and with nothing to do except sit around and play cards and tell stories. They gave us some rudimentary training. And
at the time, were you a better card player or a storyteller?
I was a pretty good card player. I learned from my dad.
What was the game of choice at the time? What were you guys playing?
Poker.
So you were able to hold your own in poker and not lose all your pay?
Yeah,
Nice.
I held my own.
There you go.
But I'd only been there about 2 weeks. And most of the fellows were there for a month or more. What they would do there at the replacement depot, they would take, like for bombers, a B-17 or a B-24, which had 10-man crews. They'd assemble, they had navigators coming into replacement depot, bombardiers, and gunners. And they would assemble those into combat crews and then train them off, send them off for further training as a crew in a specific airplane they were going to fly. So I'd only been there about a week or two, and another fellow and I, from my graduating class at Lubbock, were given orders, just the two of us, to report to the 398th Bomb Group in Rapid City, South Dakota. So we got a speed up right there. We didn't go through the rigid, ordinary process of having months in a tactical airplane we were going to fly.
So basically, at this point, they're going to streamline your training, and you're basically going to get the fast track and not get the in-depth, consistent training.
Fast track. It was faster than fast track. Because we found out that the 398th Bomb Group had just gotten its orders to join the 8th Air Force from England. They had been serving as a year as a training group, which was training other groups that were heading over. None of them had been overseas themselves, but they were all experienced people. And so the 398th Bomb Group had just received in January its orders to join the Air Force in England. Now, they weren't fully manned at the time, so they had to bring in a bunch of people like me last minute. And lo and behold, I found out that all of a sudden a replacement depot and any training in the tactical airplane. I was being sent right to a bomb group as on its way overseas, and quite an acceleration. We were the very last B-17 group assigned at the 8th Air Force. Now, at that time, the last year of the war, there were 30 bomb groups in the 8th Air Force. I may have been 32. I think there were 32. Divided into 3 divisions, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd division. The 1st division was B-17 groups only. The 2nd division was B-24 groups. And the 3rd division was a mixture of both of them.
Had you had any experience on the B-24, or did you strictly work and train with the B-17s?
I never had been into a B-24 until after the war. And I was happy I was in a B-17 group for many reasons thereafter. But at any rate, here I graduated at January 7th, and in February I was already assigned to a bomb group as on its way overseas. And I was very lucky once I got there. When I was there, I was assigned immediately to a crew, an existing crew. And it turned out to be the leading pilot and the lead crew of the whole group. So from the beginning of when I joined that group, I was in very select company. My pilot at that time was only a second lieutenant still, but he had over 1,000 hours of B-17 time and a lot of hours prior to that as a civilian. He was also 25 years old, which is as old as you could be to start out flight training at that time. And I was 17. But he had a world of experience, and so I came right under his tutelage, and I was a very lucky guy in my career from then on.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were one of the youngest guys in your group, were you not?
Yes, I was. My birthday was in March, so we actually flew overseas in late March, 43. At any rate, one day at Rapid City, there were some brand new, right up the line B-17 sitting there waiting for us. Each crew was assigned an airplane of its own. And immediately we went and painted ours up and named it and so forth.
Do you remember what you guys named it?
Yeah, they named it Anytime Annie, after the girlfriend of some guy, one of the gunners on the crew. And the interesting thing is that we flew those airplanes over to England, and 2 days later, they were all gone, and we had brand new airplanes. Just used this to fly them overseas, because they still had to go through a modification center in England to get it up to snuff for combat. I understand at that time, the manufacturers would every now and again completely revamp their airplane. So, and with what they call a new model. And we had the brand new Model G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G model of the B-17. But even then, in combat, things progressed so rapidly, they'd have to make changes. They decided they were going to make a modification to the airplane right away. They had modification centers right in England where they would send the airplane and get it prepared for combat. So they took our brand new Anytime Annie away from us, and it went to Modification Center, and eventually was assigned a group. And I read later that it was shot down on about its fourth or fifth mission over the North Sea. So Anytime Annie didn't last too long. From then on, we didn't bother naming our airplanes. We also found out that as a lead crew, you flew special airplanes. For one thing, they were equipped with radar. All the airplanes weren't equipped with radar at that time. And they had special bomb sights and special this and that. So each group had 6 or 7 lead airplanes, and then the lead crews would fluctuate flying those lead airplanes.
Now, I understand you quickly learned there was a disadvantage almost to being a co-pilot in a lead airplane, and when that happened, an NCO or a member higher up would oftentimes take your seat, and you were relegated to being a observer to the tail gunner. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. I soon found out, and I wasn't very happy about it, that the co-pilot on the lead crew was replaced by generally a senior officer. Our group commander was a full colonel, and he flew several missions with us, with him sitting in the co-pilot seat, me flying as a tail gunner. And I wasn't very happy about being killed as a tail gunner after I'd spent all that time learning how to fly.
You just went from seeing what's going on to watching what just happened out the back and staring at the faces of the gentlemen flying behind you. Now,
yeah, it was a good place to be, because later on I saw a lot of airplanes blow up. The tail used to come off intact and flutter down on its own, and often you see one figure jump out of there and open a chute, and nose chutes coming out of the main section of the airplane. So from that aspect, being a tail gunner was favorable.
From a logistical standpoint, was the escape hatch closer to the tail or to the cockpit of the plane? You could get to it quicker.
The escape hatch for the tail gunner was its own escape hatch right next to the tail gunner. So we could get out of there in a hurry. It was just very easy, just kick the hatch open and jump.
Were there any times during the war that you had to evacuate your plane, or your plane didn't make it home from a mission?
We had an engine catch fire as we were climbing to altitude, and the engines had a built-in fire extinguisher system, but we actuated that and it didn't work, and it kept burning, and we decided the plane was going to blow up any minute. We better get the hell out of there. So we all jumped, and I remember I was I was a tail gunner on that mission, so I went out the tail with 3 other gunners. We all jumped together, and we could talk to each other all the way down, and we did. And all of a sudden, we hit the ground, and I remember that landed a lot harder than I thought it would be. I was trying to judge when I was going to hit the ground.
Now, when you're in a situation like that, is jumping probably not even a concern at that point. I guess you in the forefront of your mind, you're thinking, okay, this plane's going down. Either I stay here and probably die, or I jump out of the plane and most likely survive. But I guess it happens so quickly, you probably don't really get a chance to register the idea before you even jump out that plane? It's just probably instinct at that point, fight or flight.
Well, I was never afraid of having to bail out. I always figured the chute would open, and from then on it'd be unknown. But so by then you're so used to getting shot at or getting killed in multiple ways that you're not too selective. So I didn't have any hesitancy about getting out of that airplane.
Now, when you landed, did you have the luxury of landing over friendly territory, or did you go down over enemy territory, or was it neutral?
No, we knew we were over friendly territory. We knew we were still over England, and so that was not a concern.
So once you and your two gunners landed, and you basically, I guess the first thing you have to figure out where you're at. Obviously, you knew you're in England, but not sure where at. How do you go about getting back home? You just find the nearest village and send out communication, or what's the process of the recovery for that?
Well, we all saw each other land, or we were close enough, so we got together right away. And we were in ended up in somebody's yard, so I knocked on their door, told them who we were, what we were doing. They said, well, there's an RAF pilot lives down the street. Why don't you go see him? So I did that. I went down there, and he was having breakfast. So he says, you should wait for me to finish breakfast. I'll drive you to my field. Well, he said, okay. Turns out he was a test pilot, and I forget the name of the field now. But it was their equivalent of Wright Field in this country. He took us to this field, and I phoned our base to tell them where we were. And they said they'd send an airplane down to pick us up, which they ultimately did. And
now, how many times?
While I'm there, I see these airplanes taxiing by with no propeller, and a lot of heat waves coming out the rear. Well, I'd never even heard of a jet airplane by then. Never even heard of it that I remember. So they were the first English jet. And I forget the sequence of events by then. But by then we knew that the Germans had a jet airplane, whatever that was. And we should see them occasionally. And here was the British answer to the German jet, but they were way far behind.
It was the Gloucester Meteor, I believe, was the first British.
It was the Gloucester Meteor. It was the English airplane.
What was your impression when you heard that thing take off? Because clearly the audible output of a jet engine is far, far superior than that of a prop plane. I mean, just the noise those things put off. What was your first impression when you saw that thing taxiing out on the runway?
Well, they did make a lot of noise taxiing, and they took so long to take off that they were practically out of sight down the end of the runway. By the time they got off the ground, you couldn't hear them anymore. So I didn't have any impression at all.
Oh, I got you. Now, during the war, how many times did your aircraft, or how many aircraft did you lose due to mechanical failure?
Well, that was the only time I had to bail out of an airplane. It was the only time I remember not being able to take off.
Now, I understand you flew about 7 missions or so as a tail gunner. In that time, did you ever have to engage the enemy with your machine gun?
No, I never had to actually fire that machine gun. I did fire it with airplanes so far away that I could barely see them, just so I could say I'd shot at a German airplane. But
sure.
No, I didn't have any occasions other than that. And you're right, I did end up flying 7 or 8 missions as a tail gunner. I forget now just how many, but I flew my most biggest missions as a tail gunner. Now, another thing I should explain. When we first got over there, then the 8th Air Force had developed its tactics pretty well. And they'd finally settled on 36 airplane group as an ideal bomb group. 36 airplanes in a formation.
Yeah, I believe in a past interview you said you guys had 12 ships to a squadron and 3 squads to a group.
We flew with 4 squadrons. You had an echelon of 3 airplanes and 1 tail. You had a lead plane, right wing, left wing, and tail. That would be a 4-plane unit. And with the 12 group formations, we would fly 4 of those. Pretty much after D-Day.
Now, speaking of D-Day, I understand that right around Operation Overlord, that the 600th Bomb Group participated in bombing and attacking coastal defenses of the enemies on the Cherbourg Peninsula. Did you participate in that during D-Day?
We were bombing the beach. We carried 100-pound bombs that day, and they were designed not to blow up things as much as to create foxholes for the infantry to have something to jump into.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people don't realize. Part of the strategic planning for the D-Day invasion was to have you guys lay bombs onto the beach to create craters, as you just said, to allow the gentlemen to get below the surface line to take cover from the enemy machine gun fire.
That was our function of our group. Now, different groups had different functions.
Sure.
Now, on D-Day, we flew just 6-ship formations. That was the only time I ever flew in a 6-ship bombing mission.
Was the flak fire real bad on that day, or were they pretty much caught off guard?
I did see a burst of flak in the sky that day. We were concentrating on any heavy enough artillery they had available was concentrated on the shooting at our fleet, our invasion fleet. We were just a nuisance as far as they were concerned.
Now,
D-Day.
Now, speaking of flak, the first time you experienced flak, what can you compare it to? I mean, probably very little. I mean, is it like, obviously you have shrapnel penetrating your plane, but when those bursts go off, do they create blast waves that create turbulence, or is it just simply the shrapnel penetrating your plane?
An 88 shell would blow a plane apart. They had 88, 90, and 155, I think. So even an 88 shell could do more than just create the fragments, the shell fragments. It would just blow a whole airplane apart, or blow the nose off, blow the whole airplane up. Flak did a lot of different things.
But luckily, for the grace of God, during D-Day and during your mission to provide foxholes for the upcoming landing invasion, luckily you guys didn't have to deal with flak. For you on that day, was it pretty much a straightforward mission, or did you guys have any issues that you had to overcome?
No, it was pretty much of a straightforward mission. We didn't even get shot at. I don't think we saw a burst of flak in the air even.
Those are the missions that you mark down as the best ones to go on, obviously, because you get out there, you do what you're told to do, and everybody gets home safe, and you get to fly another day. Yeah.
In fact, originally we were going to fly 2 missions on D-Day. For some reason, they called off the second one. So we just came home and turned on the radios and listened to how the invasion was going.
Now, I understand we're gonna back up a little bit. I understand prior to the D-Day invasions, one of your all's first missions was to drop bombs on the manufacturing plants of the V-1 flying bombs that the Germans were creating. But that mission didn't really go as planned, correct?
I'll back up a little bit.
Sure.
Our very first mission that we flew was May 6th, 1942, and it was to bomb a buzz bomb facility on the French coast. When we first got there, we didn't know anything at all about buzz bombs. Now, we didn't even drop our bombs at that one. Our second mission was to Berlin, and that turned out to be not much of anything either for us. Berlin was one of the toughest targets there in Germany, but a lot of the war was just the luck of the draw. Let me explain one thing. We prided ourselves on flying good, tight formations, figuring that the Germans, well, I'm sure it was true, they would rather fly through a loose formation that was where the airplanes were all close together and had a lot of machine guns. You realize there were 13 or 14 50 caliber machine guns on the B-17. It was just brilliant with armament. So they could send up a lot of shell. When you had the airplanes flying close together, it just made a more concentrated area of machine gun bullets. The Germans had to fly it through to get to us, and if we were all spread apart.
Well, it always amazed me how well your gunners did flying in those tight formations, and especially when, under attack by the Germans and the Messerschmitts, how well they did not hitting friendly, their other comrades, the other planes. I mean, you guys are in close formations. They're trying to lead the target, if you will, as the enemy plane's flying. But they also got to be mindful of the fact that there's so many other B-17s around them. It always amazed me how well they did it, not, accidentally shooting one another and taking friendly fire.
Well, still amazes me, yeah. Yeah, we used to think the same thing. But that was another story. I don't know of any instances we had where we thought one of our airplanes had been shot down by another airplane in the formation. Yeah, it's remarkable.
Would you say that your flight over Berlin was one of your toughest assignments, or was there another one that stands out in your mind as being one of the hardest assignments you had to complete?
Well, I went there 3 times. I don't remember the first 2 specifically, except we didn't get shot at. But our airplane wasn't shot at much. But the third one was my third from last, and that in itself was significant because I didn't have too many more to survive to get home. So I said, boy, I sure don't want to get shot down over Berlin. And 3 of the lead planes in groups ahead of us got shot down. And I was mindful of that when we went over. But fortunately, we got through that unscathed also.
Did your group participate in the support during Operation Market Garden?
Yeah, we did. And I did too.
What was your key role on that day? What was the main target? Were you guys going after gun emplacements? Were you bombing manufacturing plants? What was the key role for your providing support during Market Garden?
Well, I don't remember specifically what we were. I think we were just bombing troops or groups of trucks or
power stations, railroad bridges, and basically anything that would help interrupt the logistics of the German army.
Right. Mainly we were after trying to kill German troops, as I remember. But you had the lead airplane. You had the pilot of the lead airplane. Now, a lead airplane flew mostly on autopilot. You just turned on the autopilot when you took off, and kept it tuned in from the rest of the business. mission. So it wasn't particularly fatiguing to sit there and dial, twist knobs instead of fighting those big controls. So you didn't have to have a co-pilot to fill off with. That's why the mission commander would sit in the co-pilot seat, because he didn't have to fly at all, just sit there on the radio and command. So in September, our squadron commander got promoted. So my pilot, Gene Douglas, became squadron operations officer. And I ended up with the crew commander. Actually, at the same time, by then we'd gotten a lot of replacement crews in. And replacement crews, you'd have an experienced pilot fly with them for their first two missions. So by September, I was doing mostly that, and a few times they sent me along as the squadron command pilot. Now, you had your lead squadron with the group commander and the lead pilot of the mission, and the group navigator, the group bombardier, or the representative. And then each squadron had its, the high and the low had its commanders. So I was doing a little bit of each. I was flying the new crews on their first two missions. I flew with about 6 or 7 new crews on their first two missions. I flew a couple times with our old crew, and my pilot was the squadron commander. So I did quite a bit of that. And then September, October, November, things settled down. November, my pilot was leading our group on a mission, and he got shot down, and and the navigator with him, and they both survived and became POWs. We were at the same camp together. And about that time, I was promoted to becoming a flight commander. That was just wasn't a rank. It was just from then on, I only flew on lead airplanes, either as a pilot or as a squadron command pilot.
Sure.
I flew several missions as a squadron command pilot through December. On January 23rd, our Colonel Huddle shot down and killed, and we had a couple of good, capable squadron commanders. Instead of turning the group over to one of them, they brought in a guy from staff, Lieutenant Colonel Ensign was his name, and he'd flown a couple of missions with us earlier, just as sort of a tag along. First thing he did was when he took over from Colonel Hunter, and we didn't worship Colonel Hunter, but all of us really liked him. We felt he was a good commanding officer, and this guy started ragging him, and pretty soon everybody hated him, Lieutenant Colonel Ensign. About that time, and after December, few of us that had been with the group for a long time, at least had been overseas, started thinking ahead to the time the war would be over, and we would go to Japan. So we decided we wanted to stick together, and during January, very few of us flew any at all. By that time, you were in that squadron where you were determining when you flew or not. You pointed yourself as either the lead pilot or the command pilot. So if you didn't appoint yourself, you didn't have to go. And when Colonel Hunter got killed and replaced by Ensign, all of that changed. We wanted to get the hell out of there just as soon as we could.
At that time, the flight mission quota was 34, correct? You guys had to fly a minimum of 34 before you were considered to head home, correct?
No, it was 35. When we first got over there, it was 30. And then they prorated it so that if you'd had a few missions when they upped them, you didn't have to fly the full 35. And I had flown 6 missions by the time they did that. So I had to fly 34. My number was 34. And then if you flew during your career, once you flew 10 lead missions, lead crews had a higher attrition rate. You got credit for 5. So that's how I ended up with 34. And then 5 less for being more than 10 missions. So I had to fly 29.
As you got to counting down your missions, that when you got closer to the end, when you got closer to number 29, because of the fact that you had flown so many lead missions, did that affect your nerves at all, or did it make it harder, or was it just, kind of like, hey, it's one less mission, let's get this over with and go home, or was there any superstition that kind of kicked in, saying, my number's going to come up the closer I get to hitting my quota?
No, but I remember our squadron commander was a West Pointer, good friend of mine. By then, after Douglas got shot down, he became squadron commander. And so it ended up that we were going to fly our last mission together. And I remember calling him aside and saying, listen, we've flown 29 or how many up to this date. Let's not get shot down on this last mission. Let's make sure we get home. So let's just keep that in mind. So that's the time I actually thought the whole way, this is my last one. If I can make it, I'm through. So yes, that did finally come to pass.
Now, during your time in England, I know a lot of the officers from the Army and other branches of the military, they would oftentimes get almost like an adopted family to live with, so that during the downtime, they didn't have to spend so much time, in the bivouac or in a tent. They were able to retire to a home or something a little more accommodating than a cornice hut or a. During your time in England, were you assigned to an adoptive family, or did you spend most of your your spare time living on base?
Yeah, I never heard of that adoptive family. I don't think any of our people did that. I think they all had their own, lived in a Quonset hut.
Sure.
There. All the fellows that I can think of lived in Quonset huts.
Where was one of your favorite places to visit when you had a little R&R and you got to step away from the base for a little while? Is there a particular place in your mind you can remember going to on some of your downtime?
We went to London, mainly.
Down at Piccadilly Circus?
Where all the action was.
Yeah. Do some hunting while you're over there?
We've gone to Scotland to go hunting on our rest and recuperation leave halfway through our missions. And but they had a wedding scheduled for about the second or third day we were there. So we had to leave that hotel. We were trying to find another one. But by then, it's a long story, that trip to Scotland in itself. We worked through a travel agent there, and he said, I'll help you fellows out all I can with things to do up here. But he said, there's a young lady that I just hired as a guide, and if you will let her guide you on a mission, or guide her on a trip, sign you to her. So she did it, and she was a delightful gal, and she lived there in town in Aberdeen with her parents, who was a retired engineer from South Africa. So they had an extra bedroom. So Harry and I, they were kind enough to invite us to use their extra bedroom for the rest of the trip, which we did. That's another story.
What game were you hunting when you're up in Scotland? You guys going for deer, pheasant, quail? What were you guys hunting for? Just anything?
Well, what they mainly went for was grouse up there. They would have these big hunting parties with about 20 or 30 people with shotguns, beaters, and they would beat through the bush and flush out these grouse, and they would shoot the grouse. Well, we didn't have any of that. We were there about a month before hunting season, so they just let us go out and shoot pigeons on the property.
Probably not the same level of delicacy between that and a grouse.
Yeah, right.
But at that point in the war, it was probably still pretty damn good eating compared to what you're probably eating back at the base all the time.
Oh, well, we ate fairly well back at the base. I never complained about the food there.
Now, during your time during the war and flying over Europe and Berlin, and did you have anyone back at home waiting on you that you wrote letters to? Did you have a sweetheart back home, or did that come later on after the war?
Oh, I had a sweetheart.
Did that make it easier to pass your
write a letter almost every day?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. If it made it easier to spend your downtime writing letters home to help you kind of decompress and to process everything you went through. But obviously, you probably kept a lot of that to yourself so that you didn't worry the person you're writing to, I would assume.
Yeah, well, I used to write to my folks just to keep them from worrying. Wouldn't keep them from worrying, but help them out a little bit.
Sure. Now, I know, as we said before, you had a quota of how many flights you had to get in. And I know your last mission was on February 23rd. Do you remember that mission and what was going through your mind? I know you spoke a little bit earlier about talking to friend of yours about making sure you guys didn't get shot down. Did that mission feel longer than it actually was, or longer than any of the previous missions because you knew it was your last?
No, although it was scheduled to be a longer one than it was. It was scheduled to go into Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, which is right at the tip of that bulb of Czechoslovakia that went into Germany. And by the time we got halfway there, they'd called off the mission. I forget why, maybe whether it was too bad or whatever. So we actually were told to bomb a target of opportunity. And so I called up the navigator and I said, okay, we can find that day we were bombing railroad stations on all our targets I knew about. So I said, let's find a town in Germany on the way back. Find a town that's got at least two railroad lines intersecting in it. We'll call it a marshalling yard, and that'll be our target opportunity. So we picked a town called Kitzingen, Germany, and we bombed that. And there were a couple of rail lines there, and we bombed it, and had a beautiful pattern, a beautiful strike. And as far as I know, the only time Kitzingen was bombed during the war. We got home and it was just very uneventful.
So you just completed your last mission. You met your quota. Did you get sent home right away, or was it more of the standard hurry up and wait that the Army is known for? How long were you still in Europe before you finally got to go home after you reached your quota?
My last one, I think it was on February 23rd. And I wasn't anxious to get home right away because I wanted the weather to get a little better. And by then, like I said, our squadron commander, the West Pointer, was his last mission too, and he was leaving, and I was leaving, and so I said, I'll just stay over for a month or so, and let him go home, and I'll help out the new guy. By then, they'd gotten in a replacement, and so I voluntarily stayed on for another month after I finished my tour.
So after that month was up and you finally were heading home, did things seem a lot different back in the States when you got there than when you left? Obviously, the economy was better. Did you feel like the people themselves, the feeling, the apprehension, or just daily life, what was the feeling like when you came home after being gone for so long?
Well, you see, by the time I got home, it was the very first part of March, and the rumors were all in when the war was going to be over, what day it was going to be. So that was the main thing going on then nationally. I forget when the war ended.
I believe it was March of 45, if I remember correctly.
March 45. Oh, okay. It ended probably while I was.
I apologize.
I was
September of 45. The Japanese delegation formally signed the peace treaty on September 2nd, 1945.
Yeah.
And so after you got home, the war's over. How does one pick up their life? I mean, here you were in college. You're on a mission to obtain your abducted owl, your beloved mascot. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and then your life completely changed. You went from being a college student, a young man, to returning home. Instead of, you left a teenager, now you returned home a man, but you were gone for a few years. How does one just come home and pick up their life after experiencing that?
Well, personally, I thought then that we were going to end up in war with Russia. I was convinced of that for a long time.
If Patton had his way, you guys would have been.
Well, I joined the Air Force Reserve and kept flying out of McCord Field, and I always felt that sooner or later I'd get called up again to go fight the Russians.
But instead, that never happened. Obviously we went into the Cold War. How long did you stay part of the reserves, and what did you do in the reserves?
Well, I went on summer 2-week duty where you'd actually go back in for 2 weeks, get paid and everything.
What were you doing in your civilian life when you weren't reporting to the base to put in your 2 weeks to meet the requirements of the Air Force Reserve?
By then, I'd got into the insurance brokerage business. And along came the Korean War, and they started calling up a lot of us. And I was thinking of the possibility of just voluntarily coming back in. But along the way, a friend of mine and I, in college after the war, had gone into the FBI, and he was home one day, and I went and had lunch with him. And he really liked the FBI, been in Detroit, his first field office, and he'd offered to pay his own way to Anchorage, Alaska. They have a field office up there. And he offered to pay his own way to get transferred up there. So he was moving up to Alaska at the time. When he described the Bureau, I thought I might be interested in that, and I looked into it more and more. And finally, actually, during the Korean War, when I did go into the FBI and got out of the insurance business and stayed with the Bureau for 2 years till I ended up in New York City and got married. And
how old were you when you got out of the FBI and you started to settle down a little bit and met your wife?
I was 30 when I got married.
So you're pretty much well established. You spent time in the war. You joined the FBI and did the insurance thing. What did you do after the FBI?
I was fortunate enough that I was well connected in the insurance business. So I went to finished the university and got 2 degrees in engineering, mechanical engineering and industrial engineering, and that led into working for the rating bureau and all that sort of thing. So at any rate, once I decided to leave the FBI, I wrote this insurance brokers in Seattle and told them I was coming home. Would they be interested in hiring me? Well, they were. So I came in. I was resigned from the Bureau, came to work for LeBeau Hayes was the name of the brokerage firm, and was with them for the rest of my career.
Well, Mr. Anderson, I definitely appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing your story with us. And thank you for everything you did. And I just can't express my sense of gratitude for you taking time out of your day and sitting down and talking with me for an hour or so.
Well, it was a pleasure talking to you. And I noticed one of the things to talk about when it comes to World War II.
Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much, Mr. Anderson.
Well, you're very welcome.
This has been a Digital 410 production.